Carved Brink is a medium-scale campaign for Skyrim created by the same duo that produced Project AHO. And this has to be their best work yet. A lot of the design defects that are present in Project AHO were clearly improved upon. Whether that was the result of criticism or self-improvement, the results are quite clear, as I'll explain in a moment. So it might be useful to compare some of the visual design here with what was seen in Project AHO. So let's look at architecture. We need to provide evidence that architectural structure is not only present but robust, assuming the design lives up to its full potential. Let's look at focal centers in Project AHO and Carved Brink for comparison. The interior focal centers in Project AHO were relatively simple. Often they had circular boundaries if they were not corridors, and when they were corridors, they typically used a pattern formation through color and shape to provide detailing, although the geometry and hence the architectural structure itself was not complex or robust in that case. There's a huge difference between this and the focal centers in Carved Brink, which not only display a collectively, comparatively steeled architecture, but one that is robust. For example, the golden lit chamber has an interior ring of archways that provide symmetric complexity. Hanging support pillars were placed symmetrically between those archways to characterize the ceiling. The center has a multi-layered structure. There are outer archways and those in the center. This kind of decision-making as far as architecture is concerned is more expansive, creative, and perhaps even computationally challenging. Another example is the multi-level corridor that provides two de facto centers, one above the platform and one below. Pillars are placed on each side, providing for pattern, and the drastic difference between the distances of the upper center and lower center make for an even more elaborate scene. Carved Brink does this quite often with structure. Compare that with Project AHO, where, for example, you had the spinning astrolabe in the center, and outside of that was your boundary. So you had a circular boundary, and the inner boundary was just a simple ring. And if you look at that geometrically, it's essentially just two boundaries that makes basically a two-dimensional donut, planar cut of a torus. And so this is one example where there's a clear improvement as far as architectural structure. Not to mention the increase in well-organized placement of motifs across imagery. Of course, there were some exceptions to this, like the underground farm in Project AHO that had a patterned exterior structure with a circular boundary that had pillars as support that also acted as pattern creators that created, square holes every other pillar with a sun in the center, and the interior was basically organic. In most cases, Project AHO deferred to traditionalism, if you will. So there's also something to say about the innovations made here as compared to other Skyrim campaigns. Multi-level focal centers particularly are something that is not only done in Carved Brink, but done quite well. There are also symmetric connections to cylindrical chambers that are unusual and are used to adjust the architectural palette of a certain scene. So how about the atmosphere? As far as visual immersion, most of the scenes are impressive as far as they can be, save for some trivial problems here and there. Walking into the golden lit chambers or the living quarters with the floating star immediately provides a scene soaked in complementary warm colors with varying dark or pale vegetation for contrast. Curiously, the dark portions of the imagery exist at the very boundary in the former case, while everything else is well lit in the center. The scene is well put together enough that a player paying attention to the visuals is immediately distracted and forgets about their present condition. This is the same case with the Viridian Hall as well. The problem tends to be in the regions where colors are highly varied and discrete visual elements are present in the foreground of the scene with all kinds of colors. There's a lot of research demonstrating the limitation of visual attention as far as maintaining focus on multiple objects that have the same visual property, whether it be color or shape. Even recent research showing humans could attain focus on multiple colors, fewer than 3 distinctly colored elements are used, or at most 3. One such case was done by Irons and others in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. I surmise that the reason why the exterior, namely the area with the Goblin Village, is visually atmospherically difficult is because of the overabundance of discrete color elements that are often in motion, making for an even more chaotic scene. This is not helpful for pursuing a cooperative set of goals as far as making visual imagery. Take that as you will, but the exterior remains a bit off because of these clashing features. This was the same problem in the exteriors of Project AHO, and when I reviewed that, I was probably more confused about what was off-putting about the exterior atmosphere, and I think this was actually the issue to begin with. Auditory immersion is more powerful in carved Brink with the addition of music that complements the situation of the environment. Music characterizes auditory immersion in carved Brink far more than environmental sound. Project AHO had a stronger reliance on sound. Despite dominating the audio, there is some auditory ambience given by somewhat subtle sounds of wind or dust characterizing the auditory background in large areas, as well as the environmental sounds of the village in populated regions. The utility of music dominating auditory immersion is that if you have a well-rounded musician, it's far easier to capture immersion than having to craft impressive auditory environments according to various settings. There's at least as much detail here as there was in Project AHO, if not more. Miscellaneous clutter, visual artifacts, and so forth are embedded within virtually every scene. Everything is rich with detail to the degree that it has to be to present something that is immersive. The combination of environmental and interactive novelty, combined with a well-balanced arsenal of enemies, maintains the entertainment value quite consistently across the entire campaign. The risk and reward interface here is not so consistently formulated that you get a steady supply of satisfaction for every quest milestone, but the other features of the gameplay help to compensate for this somewhat. Risk and reward and the timing related to it are very important in providing emotional satisfaction, which is one of the factors that encourages humans to continue playing your level. The more optimized your level as far as feeding into that kind of system, the more likely the player is to click the continue button as opposed to clicking the quit button. The combat scenarios are also well organized. The intensity begins at an easy pace with clearly defined constraints of a few enemies with a mixed arsenal of a couple melee and one ranged, or something to that effect. And the difficulty increases mildly as the campaign progresses. But even in the most difficult confrontations, the enemies tend to be well balanced, and they are a decently balanced combination of easy to medium actors in packs that are somewhat half melee, somewhat half range types. So it's a challenge that varies and isn't especially tedious. The final boss, while not especially sophisticated, was an overall challenge and could clearly be distinguished as a boss as far as combat goes. So there are a few things that made that boss different from just some random, say, mercenary on the road that has a lot of health. This is the route to take as opposed to creating a more difficult generic enemy. There was a piece from Zero Punctuation a long time ago that said something like, just because a bad guy has eaten more energy bars than other bad guys doesn't make him a boss. Those are words of wisdom that every level designer should heed. The biggest novelty here as far as gameplay goes is obviously the magic travel spell combined with the combat scenarios that it entails. It's an out-of-the-box way to engage the player while providing challenges in the form of environments via platforms and combat zones to make a very different experience. The designers were obviously willing to go above and beyond as far as providing a new, well-constructed bonus challenge, which was the maze, that kind of entailed various kinds of traps and challenges in its own right. So one example of that is not necessarily new, but as far as I know, unusual as far as Skyrim campaigns goes, is not only the presence of monsters that spawn throughout the maze, but the black shadow monster that kind of cleans up through the maze that you have to also avoid. So those were two different kinds of challenges set up within that maze. The flux is somewhat problematic on occasion, as it appears to be difficult to discern as far as where a player needs to go next because of the nature of travel in the main world. So some of the teleportation checkpoints may be obfuscated, which will cause a stall in gameplay activity. Usually it's pretty straightforward and there isn't too much flow, as the player is stalled by combat obstacles, if anything. The levels are not only wholly conceptually grand, but the visual presentations and introductions are stalwart in their efforts to impress the player. A lot of these environments produce a picturesque imagery that is artistically competitive with the imagery in Enderal. Let's consider the maze, for instance. 9 times out of 10 across various games, when I see a maze, I just see walls. I just see an empty room in the middle, with the maze in the center of that. This is one clear distinction between orthodoxy and artistic deviance. Not only are we presented with a larger-than-life environment, but the colors, the contrast, the architecture, the grandeur all come together in that perfect point in the beginning to present the whole environment. The same can be said in the giant portal environment and even the Daedra's chambers. This isn't the only feature either. Consider the main world that is an out-of-the-box pitch at creating setting. It's not necessarily that it's big, but that the idea itself is big and the implementation coincides with that. This is probably the best example of visual I've seen aside from Enderal. There is also some benefit of creativity that allotted to the overall value of the visual impact. Patterned ceilings and walls with colored backgrounds, hanging motifs, complementary color combinations contrasting darkness and light in a strategic way are all painted on the canvas in a way that's different and unique in the context of environment. Now, the character development is somewhat sloppy where it exists. There's a clam that travels with you through the entire campaign that makes you hate your life.
Well, let me put it this way. Me has completely forgotten to tell me old friend Miss Free now. Name's, Haspat. Aye.
One who did
The
this
roles of the
work.
primary characters,
What
if they
a
ought to be called
curious
that,
specimen
are not
you
well
are.
articulated, and
Unfortunately,
they hardly have
I
any
have
personality.
no time for you. We must investigate, you see. I see a silent question in your eyes. Who am I, and what's going on? You see, Prince Paralyte, our lord, lucubrates on more pressing
The only thing that exists which does have personality is the snide douche of a clam that just makes snarky remarks the whole way to the end. Sure, there are some parts where he explains some of the background, but that's explanation. That's explanation as opposed to demonstration. The mysterious overseer and the end boss have hardly any appearances and are not especially convincing. And this also has to do somewhat with the voice acting, but I won't consider that as part of the criteria. Nevertheless, I should comment that the voice acting really seemed kind of plastic or generic.
No matter how hard you try, you'll be incapable of picturing the true portrait of the pits yourself.
As though they were imitating what a bad guy would sound like, as opposed to being an intimidating villain. But anyway, in these kinds of scenarios where it's rare that a villain makes an appearance or a person makes an appearance that is important, it would be appropriate to develop the characters quite fervently in those scare scenes when they make appearances, but that was not done. There's clearly some well-organized plot that moves along logically, but it's not sophisticated or deep, insofar as it is explicated to the player. It shows events that are happening, but the simplicity affects the interestingness of it. Nothing is cleverly thrown at the player in a way that could pique their interest. There are a couple scenes with the Overseer that favor plot development, but they're essentially stubs that aren't developed further. In one case, the Overseer explains how the world in which they are present came about with a visual background as a demonstration, with nothing else occurring. And that is essentially simply an explanation with
Also known by your predecessor, Sumerian,
some kind of visual touch to it. Compare this with, for instance, the scene in Andral, where the player performs the ritual to become one of Ark's elite warriors. The event not only performs its primary function, which is the induction ritual, but along the way it interacts with two subplots, one that unravels the character of the arrogant candidate, and the other that incites them to take more interest in the red illness. So, as you can imagine, neither of the characters that I mentioned, or the characters in general, nor the plot, are given much depth. Simply because a particular character has a lot of lines doesn't mean that they're developed, or well developed. How many of them contribute to the characterization of their personality and background? This is basically the blunder of the campaign, and the one aspect that diminishes its otherwise professional and impressive quality. So overall, clearly the design team has made significant improvements since their release of Project AHO, but the one thing that is keeping them down is still keeping them down. Of course, this is thus far the third highest rated campaign that has been reviewed, so that's also saying something.